Hello, global gardeners. Welcome to another start to your gardening week. On this Monday, we're going to be talking about a lot of gardening today, answering your questions and focus on soil to see if we can improve your understanding and the directions you might want to head to have a successful gardening season. Shout out to Mary Playford from South Australia, where it's already Tuesday, watching just after midnight. Great to have you here. And AB in Southeast Asia, Earthly Spaces in the Netherlands, and so many of the regulars that are coming back to have another wonderful episode as we gardeners from around the world get together and talk gardening. What can be better than that? I just love spending the beginning of my week with you and start talking about gardening. It should be a pretty good week, hopefully for most of us. Crazy weather here in the United States, and I've already seen some of you commenting. I have a daughter in Portland, and in Oregon and Portland, it's snowing today. So crazy weather. We're going to have more wind this whole week. And if there's one thing I don't like in the garden, it's wind. I'll get out when it's cold, I'll get out when it's hot, but I'm just not a fan of getting out when it's windy. So I'm ready for this April wind to be done so I can get out there today. This is actually a picture of my garden just about an hour ago, and wanted to show that I've got some green popping up in my beds. This is actually garlic. This is going to be my salsa garden bed. You'll see that in a future video. In this bed right here over my shoulder, this is a bunch of other garlic coming up. I've got cover crops that I'll be turning into the soil that are also greening up. And we'll be talking about cover crops in today's show as we talk about the soil and some of the things you can do to improve it. Jackie B is checking in from Portland. Roger's in North Dakota. Darren Wilson is coming to me from 30,000 feet over Arizona. That's awesome. Darren Wilson just happens to be the name of my brother. What a coincidence. And flying at 30,000 feet, I don't know that we've had that before. So that's actually maybe a first, having an airborne viewer during the show today. So that's actually fantastic. Masabi Gal, I agree with you. Wind makes you feel like someone's slapping you. And that may be part of it being out in the garden and trying to be one with nature and hear the bugs and feel the soil and just have that slap of the wind. That's a good way to think about it, because that is one of my thoughts and maybe why I don't like it as much as I probably should. So good to have you here. I want to focus on soil because if you've watched regularly my videos or these live streams, you've heard me say that soil is really the key to gardening success. You can do everything else right. You can choose the right varieties. You can put your beds in the perfect location. You can have ideal watering and irrigation practices. But if your soil isn't good, your plants aren't going to be good. It's as simple as that. You really need good soil for your plants to do the best that they can. And as most of us are approaching our prime growing season, I really want to get you thinking about what you can do with and for your soil. And for Australia, for Mary, where the season is actually starting to come to an end, now's an ideal time to start thinking about what you can do for your soil. And that's the way I approach it. I do most of my soil amending and most of my soil preparation in early spring, and then again in autumn as the season comes to an end. So ideal time for everybody to really start thinking about soil at this time. When I became a master gardener almost 20 years ago and was taught about soil, I was taught that soil has 4 main components. It's about 45% mineral, 25% air, 25% water, and 5% organic matter. And if you look up what soil is or some type of similar search, you'll see most of the universities are still using that same basic model where soil has 4 ingredients: minerals, water, air, and organic matter. What's left out, and it took me a number of years to recognize this, and I'm glad to see that many universities are starting to move in this direction, is that there's a 5th component to good soil. And that 5th component is the soil life. It's all of the growing organisms in our soils that make all of the rest available to plants. So if your soil is nothing but minerals and air and water and organic matter, your plants aren't going to be able to grow in it, because it's those soil organisms that take the mineral component and take the organic matter and make it into a usable form for plants. So after years of just thinking soil was basic and just 4 things, now when you add that 5th component, as I've discovered in just the last 10 years or so, it opens up the world to what soil can be and what soil should be. And so you may have seen documentaries about the Amazon jungle, for instance. And in the jungle, you have all of the plants, the flowers, the trees that are growing. And then you'll have billions of insects that are eating the plants and eating the flowers. And then you'll have birds and bigger insects and small mammals and reptiles that are eating those insects. And then you have bigger mammals and bigger birds that will be eating those smaller animals. And then you'll have the main predators, like the jungle cats, that will be eating some of those larger mammals. And when the predators end up dying, they decompose back into the soil, and it's the nutrients of the decomposing bodies at every step that help nourish the plants and the trees and the flowers to start that cycle over again. So it's really easy to envision the life cycle within a jungle. Now, take that same basic concept, that same cycle of life, and lower it to the point that those organisms are so small you can't even see them with the naked eye. And so within soil, we have the exact same activities that might be taking place in a jungle, but it's happening in your vegetable bed with very small bacteria that are feeding on organic matter within your soil. And then there are other organisms that are feeding on those bacteria, like nematodes and other predatory bacteria, for instance, and even fungi. And then you have larger soil organisms that are feeding on those. And then you have larger organisms that are feeding on those. And then those larger organisms, the beetles and the earthworms, when they die and decompose, they become food again for the bacteria. And so the same basic life cycle is happening within the soil in your garden. And when you recognize that and begin to understand it, now you can really have an amazing amount of success in your garden, because it's all about the soil. If you were to choose one topic to really become knowledgeable on this gardening year, I suggest that it become soil as your point of focus. So many of us, and I'm guilty of this as well, we want to become better gardeners in general. So we learn about growing potatoes, or we learn about growing tomatoes, or we have a particular type of flower and we become an expert in tulips or roses, without really understanding that the soil is what makes all the rest of that happen. So that's one reason why I wanted to focus on soil today, is just to energize you as you're approaching your gardening season and start thinking in terms of, I need to learn more about soil. I've been studying soil for years and I still need to learn more about soil. I think that wherever you are at in your gardening journey, learning more about soil will make you a better gardener and you'll have more successful plants with that. So there's the beginning, and we'll be jumping into that. Let me get to some questions to see what we have popping up. Okay, El Vaquero 555 says, speaking of organisms, I think I'm going to set up a trout line for carp to get my compost going. That's an interesting idea. The fish emulsion I've mentioned before is a nice organic fertilizer you can use in your garden, but to set up a trout line for carp is actually a nice idea. You may be familiar with the mythological story. There's some truth to it, but the idea of the Native Americans teaching the pilgrims of the early days of America how to grow corn and burying fish in the ground to grow the corn. That basic process is practiced all over the world using fish in the garden. So I like the idea of catching carp, and I actually have some trout that's in my freezer right now that I'm planning to use in a video where I talk about burying fish in the garden, because same basic idea of how you improve your plants is by building your soil. And like that little jungle of activity within your vegetable garden beds, well, the decomposing fish is very good for your plants. Think about organic fertilizers you might be using. Blood meal is a great source of nitrogen. Well, fish is loaded with blood. Bone meal is another organic fertilizer we use for phosphorus. Fish has a lot of bones. Those bones not only have calcium, but they have that phosphorus component as well. And in addition to the iron and all the other nutrients that plants need, most of those are actually contained in a fish. Burying a fish actually makes perfect sense. So I appreciate that. I think that's a nice idea. K-Stead K, I attended a soil lecture on Saturday. I do not regret that sleep disruption. I learned quite a bit. Good for you. And that's one of those things, especially in springtime for many of us, you'll start seeing more and more lectures. Nurseries will often host gardening shows, lectures, discussions, presentations. I've already done 3 this year. One at the library, one for a private presentation for a garden club, and another at an organization up the road in Denver. And so if you can find a presentation on any topic, definitely go to it. But soil is high on my list of the ones that I seek out too. And I've mentioned Dr. Elaine Ingham, who has developed the concept of the soil food web, basically that idea of a jungle within your soil. And I watch her videos every time I see one pop up on YouTube. And there's just so much information that you can watch the same video over and over again, and you'll learn something new every time that you watch it. So get out there and start watching some of those things. John says, use lime with fish so animals don't dig it up. Absolutely. And so I've mentioned that a couple times, I think, in some of my earlier videos, that the last time I experimented with using fish to grow corn was about 10 years ago, actually. And it worked great, and everything was really going well in that garden plot. The corn seeds sprouted, they started growing, and then Lily, who it was a younger pup in those days, discovered that there was fish buried in the garden. And I came out one day and all of the corn stalks had been dug up because she discovered that she could dig up fish that was just magically growing in the garden. So since then, I've learned to fence in an area where I'm going to use fish, and also something like lime is a good idea to help mask that aroma so the animals don't find it. And I'll be talking about those kind of things when I do that video. A couple months away till that video comes out, but those are some important things to be thinking about. Yeah, and Yogi Lai, amidst the snow in Portland, when I used fish fertilizer, the raccoons pulled out my plants. Definitely something to think about. And it's not only below the soil, but above the soil, all of the life we have in our garden. You definitely have to anticipate what animals you might have with anything that you do, especially the fish. But it is kind of a fun thing to do. James is saying, I pulled the trigger and planted my early spring seeds in my raised beds, but Thursday night might get as cold as 25 degrees. Hopefully my chips keep the seeds warm enough. 25 degrees is cold enough to cause plant damage. But if the seeds are just starting to germinate or haven't germinated yet, and you've got them covered with that mulch, I wouldn't be too concerned, because as long as the soil temperature is staying at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or above, that's about 4.5 degrees Celsius, then those seeds should be fine, and they'll recover fine. And I'm about to do the same thing. I'm planning this week, as I said in my recent video, my soil temperature has finally reached that point where it's warm enough for germination of those cool season plants. And the mulch that I'll put down on top of those seeds will be just that little bit of extra protection, because I know we've got more cold coming. And we're actually going to get down well below that point that you're talking about. 25 degrees is about -4 Celsius. And I have a couple days ahead where we're going to be well below that. So still a little bit too early, but it's interesting, especially looking back at this picture with some of these winter rye plants and this garlic. Nature understands that, and especially in a region like mine, it amazes me every year that the garlic pops up and it's continually exposed to some of those frigid conditions and comes through just fine. And so once you understand what plants will do well, even in your region, if you have one of those cold regions, you can see the wonder of spring as the plants are growing. So I'm just so glad to see some plants, and I hope the cold doesn't affect your plants too much, but with the mulch you should be fine. Yankee Sista, nice to see you back. Hi, Gardener Scott and fellow gardeners can't chat. Really filling new beds just in time for this live. We'll be listening. Enjoy your week. You enjoy your week as well. And I know a few of you are listening today. What a great opportunity to actually be out in the garden and be talking about gardening. I listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm in the garden. It's actually my primary form of let's say, oral activity. I used to listen to a lot of music, but nowadays I listen to podcasts, and many of them are gardening shows or gardening information as well. So that's fantastic. Shout out to Christiane from Germany. Nice to see you as well, where it would be late afternoon approaching early evening. So guten Tag to you. So nice to see the global audience checking in. Masabi Gal is saying, I have my planting schedule made, but find the spring is coming very slowly this year. What do you do with plants bursting out of my grow areas? Do I stop planting seeds or what? Great question. And I encounter that problem every year where you're hoping that the spring is going to happen, and then it's just too slow and it doesn't happen the way you want. And you get backed up. You end up with too much or too many plants, and you get behind schedule. You need to put seeds in the ground, but you can't because temperature's not cooperating or the weather isn't cooperating. It's up to you. Yes, I will often stop or delay, I should say, the plan with either the seeds or the transplants. Last year, my hardening off period was about 2 weeks late. And it was all because the weather just didn't match up with my anticipation. It may impact the rest of your season. That's one of those challenges of gardening where you want to get things in the ground. You have your plan of when you're going to put them in the ground, and then you have to shift your plan by a week or two. That happens, and that may be what you have to do, Masabi Gal. Or if you take the other approach, which is hoops and plastic, which I think are a great interim fix, is go ahead and put those seeds and those plants out like you were planning, but just go ahead and cover that bed with a layer or two of plastic to help increase the air temperature and soil temperature within that bed, or use cloches, the classic French bell jar design, or a gallon jug that you cut off the bottom. You can put those over the small seedlings and the plants, or where you're putting the seeds in, or use a cold frame over an area where you want to get seeds in. So there are some of those workarounds, or just delay it. You're really the best one to decide which works best for you, but it can be painful to delay things when you have your plan and you want to be moving forward. So I hope that helps a little bit. Susan Baker's checking in from Central Florida. Nice to see you here as well. So let's get back a little bit now to some of the soil basics that are important to understand. You need to know what kind of soil you have. And when we talk about soil, and you may have seen the triangle that is used around the world when we identify what kind of soils we have. And so one leg of the triangle is sand, one leg of the triangle is silt, and one leg of the triangle is clay. And all that clay and silt and sand mean when we talk about soil is the size of the particle that makes up your soil, with clay being the smallest and sand being the biggest. And this is where I think a lot of misunderstanding about what this means when we talk about soil types comes into play, because on most charts that we see, there really isn't a good representation of the difference in size between those soil particles. And so here's a visual representation. If you imagine that a clay particle in your soil, so if your soil is primarily clay, the size of each of those particles, let's say they're the size of a grain of salt, very small. By comparison, silt, which is also pretty small, is the equivalent of about the size of a golf ball. So clay is the size of a grain of salt, silt is the size of a golf ball. And a sand particle, if you've got sandy soil, is the equivalent of a basketball. That's how big a difference we have in our soils. Clay is extremely small and sand is extremely big relative to each other. And so when we think about the basic components of soil being the mineral and the air and the water and the organic material, the air component, which should be about 25% of our soil, when we get that small of the clay particles, there isn't a lot of air. There's not a lot of room for air pockets. And so when the clay soil gets wet, it stays wet because there's no room for the water to drain out. And the soil becomes saturated, which just totally blocks out all of the air. And so any plants that might be growing in a clay soil will often suffocate because the roots just don't have enough air. You have the opposite problem when you have really sandy soil. The air pockets actually can exceed 25%. There's so much air in that soil that when you water, it just drains right out. And when you put plants in, they don't have enough water. They have plenty of oxygen, plenty of air, but there's just no water retention in a really sandy soil because it drains away. Those are kind of the extremes. You really want a loam soil, and a loam is a blend of those three basic types, and that's ideal for most of our gardening. And so you'll see loam referred to in farming. The ideal farming soil is a loam soil. The same thing holds true in gardening. It's just many of us aren't lucky enough to have that. For me, after having done a soil test, which right off the bat, if you haven't done a soil test, you should, I know that I have a sandy loam soil. So I've got a blend of those three basic particle sizes to make it a loam, but sand is the prevalent particle size in my soil. So a sandy loam soil means mostly sand in your soil. You could have a clay loam soil, which means mostly clay, or a silty loam soil, which means mostly silt. You can look online. I have some information on that. I've talked in early videos about this idea. You can do some home tests to get a basic idea of the ratio of those three basic types. And the most common, and it's really easy, it's actually a great experiment for kids, is to take a cup of your soil and put a drop or two of dish soap, put it into a jar, a quart or a liter sized jar, fill it with water, shake it all up, and then let the soil settle. And what's going to happen is the size of the particles are going to settle at different rates. So those bigger, heavier sand particles are going to sink down to the bottom. And those medium-sized particles, the silt, are going to settle in the middle. And those really light clay particles are mostly going to float, but they'll eventually settle at the top. And then you can look at the cup of soil that you have in your jar and actually draw a line where each of those levels meet. And you might find out that you've got 40% sand, 30% silt, 30% clay, or whatever it happens to be. At the very top, the organic matter is usually floating on the surface. It might settle on top of the clay. Mostly it just floats in the water, and you can get an idea of some of the organic matter in your soil in that jar test. But it's primarily designed for you to figure out your ratio of the clay, the silt, and the sand particles. Knowing your type of soil really is a good start. There are wonderful ways to fix your soil if you've got terrible soil like I do. And in almost all cases, the fix comes down to adding organic matter, because a whole bunch of us just don't have enough organic matter in the soil. Remember, 5% is what the universities say we should have in our soil. And for some of us, after having done a soil test, I have less than 1% organic matter in my soil, which means to provide those nutrients for my plants, to encourage the soil life, well, it gets back to the jungle. A jungle isn't a jungle without all of the trees and all the plants. Good soil isn't good soil without all that organic matter to feed the life. So that's why I, every year, am adding organic matter to my soil until I can get to that point where I've got at least 5%. That's a good target. Zachary Kent, thank you so much for that contribution. I really appreciate that. New to gardening in 2022, but I've learned so much from your channel. I'm building my raised beds this week. Fantastic. I love raised bed gardening, as most of you know from my videos. That's my preferred method. So good for you building your raised beds. I'm glad to hear that, and glad that I could be of help. That's why I'm here. I just love helping gardeners out, especially new gardeners. Josh Palm just got soil test results for 3 areas, and the biggest issue is strong alkalinity in 2 of the veggie beds. of 8 and 7.8. What's the best fix? And thank you for that contribution. I appreciate it. And so again, and this is why compost is really something you should think about. If you don't have a compost pile, make a compost pile, because the organic matter, and ideally the organic matter is in the form of compost. That organic matter buffers the pH. So if you have an alkaline soil, by adding more organic material, you will drop the pH closer to neutral. And if you have an acidic soil and you add organic matter, you will raise the pH closer to neutral. Now that takes time. There's a lot of soil microbes involved, and it's reaching that point of a balanced soil with a lot of organic matter. That's the ideal way to do it, but it does take time. As I showed in the recent video where I was making the soil for my blueberries, if you have a prevalent soil throughout your landscape that's alkaline, then you can add sulfur, and that's really a couple different types of sulfur, either elemental sulfur, which tends to take longer, or you could use aluminum sulfate, which is a little bit quicker. But that's a good way to lower the pH in a large area, either in the ground or in a raised bed. And so I would ask or encourage you, Josh, to try to identify the source of the alkalinity. So if, like me, so here in Colorado, much of our soil is alkaline. So when I mix my native soil into my beds, I know I'm adding an alkaline component. And so if you haven't done a test of the soil outside your beds, that may be a good idea to find out, did you add alkaline soil to the beds? And if your native soil, for instance, is an 8.5, then it shows that your beds are actually a lower pH, probably because of that organic matter. And so if you're starting with an alkaline soil that high, you're going to need to take some action, like adding sulfur to lower the pH. But if the rest of your garden and the rest of your soil isn't that high of an alkaline measurement, then there might be some other aspect to it, like lime, for instance. Lime sweetens the soil, and the reason that we use that term is because acidic soil, really acidic, sour soil, you add lime to raise the pH, and that sweetens it to bring the pH closer to neutral. Well, if you've been adding lime or lime-based fertilizers to your garden beds, that's going to raise the pH. And that's why I say it's helpful to know what else is happening in your landscape and in your garden, because there are so many videos out there that tell you to add lime to your beds. Well, those videos are made by gardeners who are growing in areas with acidic soil. It makes perfect sense to add lime to acidic soil. But if you're following the advice of some of those gardeners or channels or books on adding lime to your soil, but you're already starting with a neutral or slightly alkaline soil, then by adding lime, you're going to increase the pH. So do a little detective work. Think about what you've done to those beds that may have increased the pH, and hopefully that'll lead you in the right direction. In the short term, particularly if you have a pH that is that high in just those two beds, watering, you can leach out some of that. That's one reason why, like the regions of the world where the soil is very acidic, they tend to be very wet regions, a lot of rainfall. And it's that rainfall that is leaching out the mineral components that actually help moderate the soil pH. And so with those minerals leached out of the soil, the result is an acidic soil. For those of us in regions where we have alkaline soil, it's just the opposite. I get very little rain in my region. And so the rain is not leaching out those minerals that increase soil pH, which is why my natural native soil has a higher pH. And so if you've ever wondered why we have such differences in the pH of our soil, a big reason is the climate and how much rain you get. And so if you end up with a bed that is too alkaline, try watering it more and trying to leach out some of that alkaline material, and that may also be a way to improve the pH. So a couple ideas for you. I hope that helps out. Just goes to show the complexity of soil, of the climate affects our soil in addition to what we're doing in our own individual gardens. So let's see what else we have. Rolling down, trying not to miss out too much. So Lisa's saying, if you only grow in raised beds with added and not native soil, do you think it's still necessary to test? My beds are mostly organics that I've added. So yes, and I think I mentioned this a week or two ago. I do think it's a good idea every 3 or 5 years, not on a regular basis. And this is the approach I'm taking, is I'm adding a lot of organic matter. I'm focusing on adding organic matter to my raised beds. I'm trying to build the soil in my raised beds, and I'm not testing the soil in my raised beds. I tested the soil in my landscape. I know what my native soil is that I'm adding to the beds, but I haven't tested the soil in my beds. After about 3 to 5 years of amending your soil and trying to build that healthy environment, then do a soil test to see where you're at, to see how your nutrient levels are, to see how your pH levels are, and that can give you a good idea of how much you need to continue that amending. And I've mentioned this before, 1 Yard Revolution was one of my favorite YouTube channels. Great gardening videos. He hasn't made videos now in 2 or 3 years, I think. But in one of his videos from years ago, he did a soil test on some of his beds because he noticed that his plants were beginning to suffer. After years of doing very well, the plants suddenly weren't doing very well. He had soil tests done and recognized that he actually had too many nutrients. The soil was too rich. It was basically overloading the ability of the plants to take up the most important nutrients, and so the plants were suffering. That's why you want to do a soil test in your beds occasionally after a period of years, because you can get to the point that you're putting too much in your soil, that you're getting well above that 5% organic matter that is considered ideal. And if you get too much, then your plants will suffer. So I'm still a year or two away from doing my own soil tests in my raised beds. But depending on how long that you've been doing that amending, it might be something to think about doing this year, just to get an idea. It's one of those things, back to Dr. Elaine Ingham, she actually encourages farmers primarily, that's her big focus, but gardeners as well, to get a microscope and to actually catalog and document the soil life that you have, and then figure out the ratio you have of the bacteria and the fungi and the nematodes. And by figuring out the ratio of your soil organisms, you can then add material to your soil to encourage some of those soil microorganisms that you might not have enough of. That to me is the extreme. And you can get to that point where you're analyzing your soil from a microscopic level and building your soil to be ideal. But for most of us, we're not at that point. There's Mala. Hello, Mala, saying hi to everybody. She's wondering what I'm doing in here, I guess. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for saying hello. Thank you for that little kiss. And she's not a big help talking about soil, other than what she likes to do to dig in the soil. So I'm glad Mala could say hello to you today. So let's see what we have. El Vaquero again. My garden is too big for raised beds. I have one next to the back door, though. Good place for kitchen gardens. Absolutely. And that's actually one reason why I like my green stock vertical garden, is because on my deck just outside the back door. It's a great container gardening system that I do as a kitchen garden. That's where I grow a lot of my kitchen vegetables that I could just go out and harvest and then use. So great idea to have containers and small beds close to your kitchen. So Carol, thank you for becoming a new member of the Gardener Scott channel. Nice to see you there. And some of you may have seen, if you're at the training or the collaboration level of the channel, there's extra perks, and we'll actually be doing a live stream right after this one for training and collaboration members. So appreciate that. Appreciate you checking in. And Llama saying Mala definitely wants something. What she wants is my attention. This is actually the time of day that we're usually out in the garden. And so by not being outside, she's reminding me, hey, what are you doing inside sitting in your chair? You need to go outside. So that's one of those things that I think I know what she's trying to tell me. R&R, I'm struggling with yellow leaves as well as drying out. I've been told I'm overwatering and underwatering. I do live in Arizona, very high wind area. Any thoughts? And so it gets back to the soil again. And so when you have that adequate amount of organic matter in your soil, that organic matter acts like little sponges where it absorbs the moisture. And so a good soil actually retains more moisture than a poor soil. And by also adding all that organic matter and then understanding the particle size of your soil, you can get an idea of the drainage of your soil. So if you have a mostly sandy soil, which probably would be expected in a place like Arizona, your water is going to drain quicker than the rest of us that don't have as sandy a soil. And so that could be a reason for overwatering and underwatering, is because you haven't figured out the drainage, or the drainage is just, sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's not. And then you throw in the winds, which dry out the soil even more. That exacerbates the problem with over and underwatering. So right off the bat, talking about soil, make sure that you're amending your soil. You've got some good compost in it, that it has that water retention ability. And then mulch, especially in windy areas, mulch is the key. And you can see, even in winter, and even as these plants are just starting to pop up in my garden, I've got mulch everywhere. This whole week is going to be windy. Today is actually one of the lesser of the windy days, because it's only going to be 35-mile-an-hour winds today for me. This whole week is going to be windy. If I don't have mulch on the beds, as these little plants are starting to pop up, the soil's going to dry out. So mulch is critical for reducing that soil evaporation and helping you to figure out the watering schedule for your plants and what they need. Organic matter in the soil, mulch on top of the soil, and that's a great way to begin to get it under control. And then test. Don't automatically assume that your plants need water or don't need water. I've said this before. Your finger is one of the best tools in your toolbox for the garden. Go out and physically check the moisture level of your soil before you water. And so, especially on windy days or after a period of wind, before you put water on your plants, stick your finger in the soil, dig a little hole, and see what the moisture level is 2 inches down or 3 inches down. Because it may be dry on the surface, which often isn't a problem. But if it's moist at root level, then your plants really don't need additional water. And so by getting your finger in the soil and checking the moisture level, you can help reduce that problem, because you won't water when the plants are happy, and you will be watering when you recognize that they're beginning to dry out a little bit. So yeah, I'm out there, and I still do that. I can usually look at my plants and get a pretty good feel for how they're they're feeling whether they need water or not. But I still stick my finger in different beds at different times at almost every day before I water, just to be sure. Because even those of us that have been gardening as long as I have, I still will overwater and underwater if I don't pay attention to the soil and the moisture level and what the plants specifically need. So hope that helps out a little bit. Let's see. Gonna scroll and try to catch some of the questions that I may have missed. Ram Amandeep says, I got my first taste of Wyoming winds this past week. So yeah, Wyoming just up the road from me in Colorado, and this whole region of the Rocky Mountains with Montana. I've lived in Montana and Wyoming and Colorado down to New Mexico. It's windy. It's just what to expect. And so I'm glad you got your first taste of them. I'm sure you're going to encounter many more as you spend time in those regions. Dwayne saying very windy in Edmonton. So yeah, Canada, I'll still, when we talk about the Rocky Mountains as well, there's a lot of regions that are definitely very windy. R&R, thank you for that contribution. I appreciate that. I've not mulched yet. Thank you for answering my question. And so, so mulch also plays into the topic of the day, soil. And so there are a lot of reasons for mulching and a lot of different types of mulch. When I talk vegetable garden and landscape garden, I'm primarily talking about organic mulches, the kind of material that will decompose in time. And by decomposing, they're adding organic matter to the soil, to the top of the soil. I will also mulch with inorganic mulches, like rocks and gravel in some areas because specific plants like those kind of conditions to have a rocky mulch. Most of my landscape and vegetable garden are mulched with organic mulches. Chips, wood chips in particular, if you look back in this back area where I'm building my my pollinator and cutting garden, those are all wood chips. And my pathways and areas around the beds are wood chips. But in my vegetable garden, I use crushed leaves, dried grass, and straw primarily as a mulch. And I'll mix all of those together in a windy environment because they tend to hold together better when you've got a mix of different sizes and different types of material. And the reason I like to use those kind of mulches in my vegetable garden in particular is because I'm amending my soil. I'm turning my soil. I'm adding organic material to my soil at least once, often twice a year, as I said earlier. Well, that straw, those leaves, that grass, if it's on top of your soil during most of your growing season, and then in autumn, you turn it into your soil as an addition, as an amendment of organic matter, it will be broken down by the soil organisms pretty quickly. That's why I use those ingredients. Wood chips won't break down very quickly at all, and they can cause a nitrogen depletion as part of that decomposition process. So that's why I don't use wood chips in my vegetable garden. You can. You just need to brush aside or rake away the wood chips when you transplant or start seeds, and then cover the soil again. Just try to avoid burying the wood chips. If you have a really bad soil with essentially nothing but clay or nothing but sand, you can actually add wood chips to the soil to help build the soil structure, to add a big chunk of organic matter. Recognizing it's going to take a long time for that to decompose and break down, you probably don't want to be planting within the first 6 to 12 months after doing that kind of amendment. But that can be a fix for really poor soil, is by adding a lot of that really chunky organic material, or adding organic material of all different sizes to really help build your soil. So couple ideas with mulch there, because I think it's a multi prong approach. All of my beds, as I've shown in videos, have wood chips, branches, twigs, leaves in the bottom of the bed, primarily in my dry region, as that organic matter to help hold and retain the water when it begins to drain through the bed. The bottom of my beds will tend to be moister because of all that organic matter, but also because it's food for the soil organisms. And the earthworms in particular will carry all of that decomposing material back up into the soil. And then by having a mulch on top of the soil, you're doing the same thing. So you amend your soil by putting ingredients into it, and then you can also build your soil by having good organic matter below it and good organic matter above it, and then just kind of let nature mix it all together. And especially when you have the wind and the water concerns, that can be an approach to really help improve your soil and make it better in the long term. So let's see, Mage Grey Wolf saying, a friend is growing roses and I told them to use pine needles as mulch. They didn't listen and bought some dyed wood chips from the store. The dyed wood chips, if you do any type of research into some of those companies, they're taking pallets, shipping pallets, and chipping them up to make the chips and then dyeing them. Now, most of the dye, as I understand it, is organic based, but if you use, and I've done this before, if you use dyed wood chips on your roses or whatever type of bed it might happen to be, it looks great in the first year, but that dye is going to leach away within the first year, and then you're going to be left with a different color, a more natural color, because the dye is gone. So if you do like to use the dyed wood chips, you're going to have to keep reapplying them on a regular basis. I like using the more natural. I've got a couple sources near me, and wood chip or chip drop, getchipdrop.com is a good source for getting wood chips from trees in your area. The arborists that are going out and pruning and cutting down trees and chipping them up, they'll drop them at your doorstep and you'll have a ton of wood chips. And so all of these wood chips all throughout my landscape have come within probably a 10-mile radius of my house. So it's all my native trees that I've gotten from some source nearby where they'll chip up all of that woody material. And I think that personally, I prefer having that type of mulch, that I have a better familiarity with the source that it's coming from my area than to buy a bag of chipped up shipping pallets, and who knows what's in those, because some of those pallets, if they're an international pallet, they've been treated with herbicides and pesticides, and you could be introducing chemicals to your garden through some of those bagged mulches. So just be aware of that. That is one of those side effects if you do that. Okay, let's see what else we have. Sunset Gazing says, dyed wood chips get washed into my yard and walkway and driveway and leave black spots all over the place. Not good. Yeah, another reason that dye's going to leach out. So it can stain your bricks, stain your sidewalks, stain your driveway. Another reason that I tried to avoid it. Okay. Oh, I did want to get back to the idea behind the jungle idea and the life that's in your soil. And so you may have heard, and I've said this before as well, it's a pretty common description of what a good soil looks like. That if you take a teaspoon of a good soil, within that teaspoon, you're going to have up to 1 billion bacteria, alive, living bacteria in that teaspoon, which is just an amazing idea that there's that much life in a teaspoon of good soil. But what is so seldom mentioned is all the other life. We think in terms of compost, which is typically broken down by bacteria. And we talk about the good soil bacteria, but there's so much more to good soil life. So in that same teaspoon of good soil, you'll have fungal threads. There's fungi growing in a good soil. And if you were to take all those fungal threads and lay them end to end, you would have a thread 2 to 3 meters long in a teaspoon of soil. That's how small those fungal threads are. That's how so small these organisms can be within our soil. The fungal threads are a critical component, and you don't even know it's there. You can't even see it. If you think about some of the other microorganisms, the flagellates, these really small organisms that require a moist soil because they're moving through those gaps between the soil particles and they're moving within the moisture, the water in our soil. There will be thousands of these little flagellates that are moving through our soil, which is absolutely incredible to me. There's these other organisms called ciliates. Same thing. There will be hundreds of these ciliates in a teaspoon of soil. Nematodes. You can have dozens, maybe even hundreds of nematodes in a teaspoon of soil. And if you've got a really good soil, you might even see an earthworm or two if you were to just scoop out a little bit of that soil. So it really is a jungle of life in the smallest components of our soil. And that's why Dr. Elaine Ingham says, get your microscope out and see all of that happening to determine if your soil is healthy to the point that you want it to be. Because these things we don't even think about. We think about soil being just 4 basic elements and that's all there is to it, and we just go about our planting. But when you start really breaking down what's happening inside, and then when you start talking about the different types of bacteria and fungi, we have our soil bacteria, and by definition, it's the bacteria that's living in the soil. But there are some types of bacteria that we would consider soil bacteria that are actually living inside the plant roots. And it's the interaction of all of these different types of microorganisms that are moving between the roots and the soil. The fungal threads that are moving in and out of the plant roots. That's how all of this is happening. That's how the nutrients are being passed from the soil into the plant. So if you don't have that fungi, if you don't have that bacteria, then you could use all the fertilizer you want, but it's not going to be able to make it into the plant because you have to have those soil organisms at play, at work, and it's just incredible. So you can see that I love talking about soil, and I've done some of this analysis, I've done some of this research, and I'm doing what I can to improve it. This area of research for you is just, the sky's the limit. There's just so much that you can learn about all of these different things. So let's see, Lisa Potter saying, is it necessary to add native soil into your raised bed soil? They're built on top of native soil with no barrier. So yes and no. So I do think your beds should have access to native soil. And so if you put a raised bed on top of native soil, that's a great start. Because your native earthworms, your native arthropods, all those native flagellates and fungi and bacteria are going to find their way from your native soil into your raised beds. But when you think about the size of some of these microorganisms, it's going to take a long time. These beds behind me here are about 20 inches tall. It's going to take a long time for a microorganism to traverse that distance. Generations, because a single bacteria is never going to travel that far. It's going to have a second generation and a third generation, and each generation may find its way higher into my raised beds. If you add your native soil to your raised bed, then you're adding some of your native soil life to that raised bed, and you're accelerating the process. So it's not absolutely necessary, And as I've said in videos before, you can bring in good soil in your raised bed and start gardening right away. Start putting plants in the ground. But you may not have the native organisms that survive. And the reason I think native organisms are so important, especially if you live in a challenging climate, what's growing in your yard, what's growing in your landscape and your garden right now is alive and can survive in the conditions of your specific garden. If you bring something in from outside, there's no guarantee how well that's going to do, because those are going to be different organisms. It's going to be a different soil life. And so I think it's a good idea to take some of the life that you know will survive in your specific garden, add that to your beds, to whatever soil you bring in, and it just helps the balance reach an equilibrium sooner, because you're incorporating life that has already demonstrated it can grow in your yard, and you're just making it easier for it to grow because you're giving a ton of food through all the organics and plants and everything else that's happening in your yard. So yes, at the basic, having the bed open, that's why I'm not a big fan of putting a barrier at the bottom, but throw some native soil in. And it doesn't need to be a lot, because bacteria will repopulate pretty quickly if given the right soil and air and food that it needs. But it definitely can help out a little bit. So, okay, let's see. Rural Girl's wondering if probiotic powder to be beneficial in any way. And it's that same basic concept. So, possibly, so I've said this before as far as buying earthworms over the internet, or buying the fungal spores or the mycelia or any of the probiotics. If you're getting them from someplace that's not your yard, there's no guarantee that they'll survive in your yard, because the soil temperature, the wind, the weather, the sun, all of those aspects have a huge impact on what will survive in your garden. And so here in Colorado, with our extreme temperatures, if I were to buy something from South Carolina or Texas or Oregon and incorporate it into my garden, I would hazard to guess that it would not survive my winter, that it probably wouldn't survive my summer. So it might give me a short-term impact on my soil and on the plants, but there's no guarantee of any long-term impact. And so most of those kind of materials I stay away from, just because they might be beneficial for a season, probably a week, if not just a couple days. But I like to build my soil from the ingredients I have in my yard and in my region, and I'll have more success with that soil because it'll be my native organisms that are working on my soil. So that's generally how I look at it. And so Kevin's asking, would native mulch homemade bring in microorganisms? Absolutely. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. That the source of my wood chip mulch is just down the road with all the trees that are growing in my region. So all the fungal spores that are blowing through the air that are landing on the trees a mile down the road, if I use that mulch in my garden, then I'm introducing the fungal spores that are native to my region. And fungus is a good thing in the soil, and we can incorporate the fungi by adding the native wood chip mulch. And the same holds true with all the other type of mulches. If you're using grass clippings, same thing. The grass clippings you're cutting from your yard will have a lot of those microorganisms on them. And when you use that in your garden, you're just moving it from one section of your yard to another section of your yard. So absolutely, that's the way I look at it, is homemade native mulches are a great way to really accelerate the process of incorporating some of the organisms. And it's not all microorganisms. Sometimes it's larger organisms that hitch a ride in some of that mulch as well. I've actually picked up some loads of the wood chips at the wood chip site, and as I'm unloading my trailer, especially after a couple days of rain, that the wet fine material at the bottom of the pile will have earthworms in it. And so these are earthworms that are native to my area, but they hitched a ride from the compost slash wood chip site down the road, that they crawled into the wet, moist food of that fine mulch material, and now they find a way into my garden. So a lot of those kind of things will find their way if you allow it, and if you use your native and local ingredients. Let's see what else we have. Linnea saying, I made a new pile of compost yesterday on top of cardboard. Added worms for my yard. There you go, same idea. And I've talked about this before too. I think last week or the week before I was talking about the kids at the Galileo Garden, and we would collect the earthworms that we'd see on the sidewalk or any place else. If we were digging up in an area where there were a lot of worms, we'd add worms to the compost pile, add worms to our beds that we knew were low in worm activity. Great idea. Same basic idea. If you can use your own native worms in your garden, I think that's a much better approach than buying a worm from someplace else and not knowing, one, if that worm is going to survive, but it's possible that you might actually also be introducing a new species that will run out the natives. The jumping worm we talked about a month or so ago, that's really beginning to have problems in the eastern United States. The jumping worm is an earthworm, but it is outpopulating native worms in a lot of areas of the country now because it was introduced. Another reason I'm not a big fan of introducing something from outside my region, because you just really never know for sure what the impact is going to be. Okay, there's Jay. Always nice to see Jay and Heidi here. Wonderful moderators. It warms my heart when I see my wormy friends in my raised beds, compost, leaf mold bin, make bed and breakfast for warm friends. Absolutely. And that's yet another reason. You know, I talked about the jungle of life in your soil. Worms are a really good indication of how healthy that environment is. We talk about the Amazon jungle and talking about the panthers and the leopards and the big cats. And if you don't have the big cats, then the whole system loses balance. And it's the same thing in our soil. When you start seeing the earthworms in particular, it really shows that your soil is reaching a good point of balance. And even when you start seeing beetles, grubs in your soil can actually be a good sign that your soil is starting to reach that point of balance, because the arthropods can be an important component, and you start thinking about beetles and larger insects in your soil, that's often a good sign. Now, it also becomes important to identify specific species, because if you see some of these grubs or some of these beetles, it might not necessarily be a good plant beetle, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. You can deal with that, and recognizing is the first step of being able to fix the problem. But nematodes, you can buy beneficial nematodes. Same basic idea. In the short term, a lot of the nematodes and bacteria that we'll buy can make a difference. And they may end up having a permanent home in your garden if the conditions that those type of organisms came from are matched by what you can provide in your garden. Build it, they will come. I don't think you need to worry too much about bringing outside things in. Put the organics into your soil, and those earthworms will find your soil, and you'll be happier for it. I love digging a hole to transplant something and seeing the earthworms. You should see earthworms every single time you dig a hole. That's a good sign of having reached that point where your soil is healthy, when you can see the soil life. You can assume in that teaspoon that you have all of those things that are there. You're going to need a microscope to see it. An earthworm you can see, and it's a really good indicator. look for earthworms, and hopefully you'll have it. Urban Chicken Mama said, it's hard to leave the worms alone. My chickens fight for them and love it so much. I try to give only sometimes. And I think I've said before, my neighbor's chickens made it into my garden last year, and they were eating grubs and earthworms as much as they could. So I agree with you. It's hard to keep the chickens away unless it's one of those things that you want the chickens there. Okay, let's see. Nine Moon Planet, using worm castings, dripping water through a teaspoonful in a fine sieve. Makes a great natural fertilizer. I'm trying to overcome canker in an apple tree using it foliar. And so it actually raises a good point. So worm castings, making a worm tea, making a compost tea. There's often a misconception as to how we should use worm tea or compost tea. The assumption being that we add it to our soil and that will make our soil better. There's some truth to that, but as you've pointed out, a better use for those type of teas is as a foliar spray to actually fight fungal diseases in particular, because the bacteria in that tea, that extract we're making, can actually have a huge impact when we spray it on our plants. So don't necessarily think that, don't look for the quick fix with your soil, thinking that adding a worm tea or a compost tea is going to boost the soil life in your soil. It's going to have minimal effect. When you learn more about it, you find out a better application is exactly that, spraying it on your trees. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's actually a really good idea. Connection of lives and interests. We don't have worms here on our 1 acre sandy lot. And so organics, like organics. Add organic matter to your soil and they will find it. There should be worms near you. I've talked about this at the Galileo garden, but I've seen it in my own garden here. No organic matter in my soil to speak of. Highly compacted soil. You would think that the earthworms couldn't dig through it. Very dry. But once I started using thick layers of mulch on my soil and working to keep my soil evenly moist throughout most of my garden, the worms appeared out of nowhere. 3 years ago, when I first moved to this house, I would have told you I don't have worms in the area I'm going to be putting my vegetable garden, because I didn't have worms. But once I started making the environment attractive, they appeared. And then when I saw the worms on the sidewalk or the driveway or dug a hole someplace else and dug up a worm, then I brought them into my garden space. So I would suggest take that approach. Go ahead and build the garden area with all the organic matter in the soil, and then try to find some native worms. And a good source for that, if you know a good bait and tackle shop where you can buy worms, many regions where you buy worms for fishing, the people that are selling those worms just dug them out of their backyard. And their backyard may not be too far from your backyard. And so that is one instance where I think buying from an outside source can actually work. If that outside source is near you in the same climate, same region, you might be able to incorporate some earthworms into your landscape by going to a bait shop and buying the worms that somebody dug up that lives near you. That can actually be a pretty good approach. Frank says a bucket of leaf litter from under a big old tree added to the sandy soil can seed worms in it. Yeah, good idea. Exactly the same idea, that a thick layer of leaves that you keep moist, and that'll help keep the soil moist underneath it. The worms are going to find it. They're everywhere, and they will find you if you give them a place that is worth finding. And I like that idea. I think that actually works pretty well. And so Eileen's asking a good question. Can you put red wigglers directly into your soil? And so This gets back to the idea of what's going to survive in your landscape. So red wigglers are the kind of worms that are most often used for vermicomposting, for having like a bin in your basement where you feed them food scraps and the worms will make worm castings, usually indoors. Red wigglers are a very finicky worm. They actually only eat and thrive in a very small temperature range. And so when the temperature is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, about 10 degrees Celsius, that's way low. And they'll start to die when it's that cold. When it gets to 90 degrees, which is about 32 degrees Celsius, they'll die. It's too hot. So if you can keep your soil temperature in a range between 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 Celsius, to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, about 26 Celsius, if you can keep your soil temperature in that range, then the red wigglers will survive. And yes, you can add the red wiggler worms to your soil. They do their job. They're going to live in just the top few inches. They don't burrow very deep. And as long as you can sustain those temperatures, they'll do okay. The problem for most of us is that our soils get too cold in the winter and often get too hot in the summer, and that's enough to kill the red wigglers. So while they're ideal worms for vermicomposting inside a house, for most of us, they're not a good garden worm. They'll still do their job of improving the soil because as they die, they're going to be food for all those other soil organisms, which, it's really a wonderful solution. You're adding organic matter to the soil, might as well add dead earthworms to your soil because some other organism is going to eat that. But as far as them being active and eating, they're not the best choice for most of our gardens. So connection of lives and interests, saving this live to playlist. You're super helpful. Well, thank you for that. And I appreciate it. Yeah, this is one of those, I like that idea. And I do have a playlist, and I update it occasionally on my homepage, the Gardener Scott channel, with live streams. But you can just go back into the library. And I think this is number 106. So we've been doing this for a couple years now, almost every single week. And of course, we'll continue doing this for many weeks to come. So I'm so glad you're appreciating it and putting it into your list. Don Matten, I live in a very sandy area. All the nutrients run right through it. I did raised beds. I also dig 20 inches down into the sandy dirt. Did the same approach to the sandy soil. Will that work? I think so. That's a great idea. And so you can put your raised beds on top of the soil you have and fill your raised beds with good soil. Great approach. Love it. I do it. That's what I recommend. If you can dig down into your soil first, amend it, then put your raised bed on top of it with good amended soil, then you're making it easier for those soil organisms to find your raised bed, because all the surrounding soil is poor, and now 20 inches down you've got basically a smorgasbord, a buffet that's going to attract all of those organisms, and they're going to eat their way up into your bed. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful approach, especially in sandy soil, because the sandy soil is going to drain so quickly for the most part, that having that kind of approach to digging and amending, keep it amended on a regular basis. But yeah, I definitely think you're on the right approach, and that's a great way to approach it. And all of this, when we talk about soil, this is a long-term activity. This isn't a put compost in your soil once and you never have to do it again. It doesn't work that way. You will need to continue to add organic matter to your soil. You can reach a point when you have that healthy soil life that you can get by with no-dig gardening. When you have an ample amount of organic matter in your soil, you have all of that soil life. Like I talked about before with building soil from below and above, in the future, you can just add a couple inches of compost on top of your soil, like Charles Dowding in the UK does, and that should be enough to maintain the soil life and the health of your soil. The problem for many of us is we don't have that soil life yet. We don't have the soil structure developed yet. And so if we have terrible compacted soil with no earthworms, with no organic matter, and all we do is just add a couple inches of compost to the top, it will improve over a long period of time, but longer than most of us are willing to wait. That's why we have to work it in, amend it, get the soil up to that point where it's at least 5% organic matter. Then we can sit back a little bit, rest, and just add some stuff to the top, maybe occasionally digging it in a little bit, and it becomes much easier. But it's work to get to that point. And generally, 3 to 5 years is a target for how much you're going to need to amend your soil to get to that point when your soil life becomes basically self-sustaining. You just need to throw a little food on top and it'll keep going. If you're already starting with really good soil, and that's why a soil test is so beneficial. If you're starting with that really good soil and you have all the soil life and you have all the soil nutrients already in place, then yeah, you may not need to dig as much. You may not need to do all that amending. You may be able to just get by with compost and mulch on top from that point forward. But you got to have that baseline figured out to be able to move forward. So hopefully you recognize that this isn't easy. It's work. Gardening generally is work, but it's one of those activities, one of those garden work functions that really will pay dividends in the future because the soil is critical. It really is key. So I have a question for you today. And the question is, how important is your garden? Give you a second to think about that. And a secondary question. How important is gardening to you? And which is more important? Is gardening more important to you, or is your garden more important? And the reason I asked this question, I did a recent video where I was talking about challenges in your garden, how to deal with some of the challenges, and I identified some of my challenges, and I live in a very challenging region. It's hard to garden here. And whenever I do a video like this, inevitably I get at least one, usually a couple comments saying, why don't you move? Why don't you just move to an area where gardening is easier? And that's why I posed that question to you today. If all of us wanted to have easy gardening and we were willing to move to an area where gardening was easy, well, think about it. All of us would be living in a place like California, where gardening for the most part is easy. In the San Joaquin Valley, Central California, you can grow anything. What would it look like if there were no gardeners in any place but California or South Carolina or any other region of the world where gardening is relatively easy? And so I think there's a lot more to gardening than your garden and the location of your garden. I like the activity of gardening. Now, I live in Colorado for a number of reasons. Beautiful state. I have my daughter and granddaughters here. I have lots of friends here. Friends and family are a big reason why I'm here in Colorado. I love the activities, not so much the winter activities as much as the summer activities, getting out and enjoying the mountains and everything that Colorado has to offer. So I'm not looking to move because gardening is just one aspect of my life, a very important aspect of my life. But my garden and the location of my garden really doesn't matter as much as just having a place to garden, the gardening activity. And so I pose this question to you today because all of us have different challenges all of us live in different regions. We all have our own unique garden space with its own unique garden issues. And I regularly say that gardening isn't easy. I don't think it should be easy. If it were easy, we'd get bored. We'd walk away from it because there's no challenge. I like the challenge of gardening. And so when someone poses a question to me, why don't I move? The thought really never even enters my mind. I moved to this house knowing that this house was going to be a little more difficult gardening than the previous house I was in. But I wanted all this space. I wanted to build a garden from scratch, and I wanted some of those challenges. The actions of gardening and taking those challenges and learning how to overcome what I need to overcome to have success is important to me. And so how important is it to you? If you like easy gardening, there are ways to have it easy. If you like that challenge, then like most of us, you're going to encounter those challenges pretty much every day in the garden. But how much have you actually thought about it? And so I asked that question, and it kind of ties into what I talked about last week as well, is so many new gardeners give up because they expected it to be easier. And when they recognize that gardening isn't easy, they give up and they don't garden again until maybe they move somewhere and it is easier, and they've lost out on all of that time they could have been gardening. Now, would I love to live in an area where my season was 200 or 250 days long as opposed to 130 days long? Oh, absolutely. Would I like to live in a region that doesn't have windy weeks on end? And yesterday, the humidity here was less than 5%. 5% humidity in this entire region. Extremely dry. Would I like to live in a nice moist region where the rainfall watered my plants? Well, sure, that would be nice. But I like the challenge. I like Colorado. I like my garden, and I like gardening in my garden. So whatever your challenge happens to be, wherever it is you're living, make the most of it, and don't necessarily think in terms that the grass is greener on the other side, that someone else's garden is better or some other location is better. Well, of course, all of us can look at our garden and recognize that someone else has it easier. Someone else's garden is better than ours. So what? Who cares? I'm gardening in my garden, you're gardening in your garden, and we need to make the best of it and the most of it. And I'll continue to complain about my challenges and tell you how I overcome them, and I'll show you the things that go wrong and the things that go right, but you're probably not going to hear me say that I wish I didn't live in Colorado where gardening was so hard, because that's what makes it extra special. The easy fruits, I don't think taste as good as the difficult fruits. When you have to work and struggle and learn and experiment and finally get to the point where you have success in your harvest, it just tastes so much better than the stuff that you don't even think about. That plant that fruits that just fruited, and you eat it and you taste it and you forget about it. That's a big difference to me. I really like the work, the effort, and the challenge of being in an area like this. It's not always fun. It's not always something I would recommend. If you had a choice, I would not say move to Colorado to garden, because this isn't a prime spot for gardening. But if you were moving to Colorado, I would say garden, because it's the activity of gardening that is so special. It's getting out and getting those opportunities in nature to build your soil and to build that balance and to see it all come together. That's what makes it special. So take that with you going into this gardening week. Think about why you're gardening and recognize that when you have those tough moments, Would you rather have those tough moments where you are right now, or would you rather have them someplace else? And I would hazard to guess that as hard as it is for you, you're probably pretty happy to be in your own garden right now, because your garden is special to you, and relish that idea. Embrace it, enjoy it, and then move forward with it as you approach the rest of your gardening week. I hope it's a great gardening week for you. Thanks to everybody who was here today and listening in your garden while you work. I think that's fantastic. And I'll see you back here next Monday. Same time, same channel, same kind of discussion as we learn more about gardening. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.